time for some questions. We'll just let people settle. I wish the conversation people well.
I'm not sure it's a question. I just wanted to try to make a connection. I learned recently about some political developments in the UK, and some of Dr. Smith's comments at the beginning prompted me to remember this, that I think are connected to the beginning framing of this talk. So a little bit roundabout here. There's a group in the UK which has drafted and promulgated something called the Euston Manifesto. Euston, as in Euston Station. And it turns out that the authors of this manifesto, from what I can determine, are kind of odd marriage, not so odd marriage of liberal Democrats and old Marxists against what they call the radical left and the postmodernists. And one of the foundations of this manifesto is that they are trying to reassert universal liberal values, right? And that they are, for example, arguing that the radical left has made an unholy alliance with religious fundamentalism of an Islamic variety in its opposition to the war in Iraq and the American occupation of Afghanistan. And they say that the left has gone completely awry on this because there's really, that ultimately the equality of women and the prospects of women in Afghanistan, amongst other reasons, but this is the one, of course, everybody is referring to now. The situation of women in Afghanistan critically depends on the defense of certain liberal principles and values as universal, right? And I sort of found myself in the position of being asked to comment on this manifesto. So, and there's all kinds of ways into critiquing it, and there's obvious, an obvious point to be made about the limits of the kind of sameness version of equality in liberal discourse to really take into account the ways in which people are discriminated against and excluded. But maybe if we could go back to this, something you said in the beginning, I was just wondering how would you answer that? I mean, how would you respond to that? I'm interested how within this framework you would.
How would I respond to the question about needing to adopt universal liberal values?
To their assertion that the left has gone, too far in the direction of cultural relativism, essentially.
Okay, number of points. On the Afghanistani example, I think what's striking about that is precisely what Dr. Smith alluded to at the beginning, and I try and get at in the paper, is the ways in which different kinds of racialized women, and this is echoing the work of Gatli Spivak, are both made hyper-visible and hyper-invisible in the same moment. And the ways that operates is to sustain different kinds of norms is precisely what I'm trying to get at in this paper. On the question of has the left gone too far, I would argue that the left hasn't gone far enough. Even on its own terms, the left continues in some ways to adopt the very kinds of tools that it says it's critiquing. Therefore, ending up in the same kind of enlightenment project that I think some of, even some critical feminists have not gone far enough in terms of, say, for example, and this is what I was trying to get at in terms of the processes, the focus on race, gender, and class rather than the processes of racialization, gender, and class. So, in answer to the question, has the left gone far enough? I would say no. In fact, I think the left needs to have a critical reflection at this time rather than adopting the kinds of strategies that re-entrench various kinds of identity norms, it's exactly this that we need to examine. I mean, this makes me think of the work of thinkers like Wendy Brown, who argue that in fact it's the left reiterating the very injurious identity that it wants to dismantle by invoking that identity within, say, the liberal discourse of rights. So what is it to invoke the idea that Afghan women need rights in a particular kind of context of US imperialism? Oh, is something being reiterated that in fact is more damaging to those women? So yes, I don't know if that answers the question.
Sure.
My question goes in an entirely different direction, so if anyone else wants to pick up on this, I'm happy to hang on.
You know what?
Just thought I'd take that. Rita, I really enjoyed your mapping and your insights, and I want to go back to the social accountability, and where you started your paper, as I heard it, was around the discipline. And so I'm wondering how we take our disciplines or bring our disciplines to account in the kinds of ways that you suggested, which I can see working in individual scholarship and in subfields and so on. But I think you're actually suggesting something a little more radical than that. And so I'm curious about how you would think about that, because one of the things I liked about that notion as I heard it was it actually takes us out of that binary that scholarly work is something that goes on in the academy and political work is something that goes on outside of that. And I think you're really disrupting that through the notion of accountability. So I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit more about what it means to bring a discipline to account in the kinds of ways that you're talking.
Well, there are two notions of accountability playing out in that framing of it, and this is the way I think Razak understands accountability. One is that it is an individualized undertaking. It's a self-critical reflection to examine our own complicity in different norms of domination, and the other is, and she does talk about this but doesn't really draw it out, and that's what I'm trying to do here, is the notion of who's doing the constructing, what's being constructed, and with what effects. So what are, so I'm kind of like going around the question of what does this mean for the discipline? I mean, in some ways it raises very kind of employment issues, I guess, is a way. Representation, in some ways, in terms of who's constructing the discipline and from what perspective. But I also think it goes to the ways in which we approach topics that seem to be familiar to us in some ways. So, for example, the study of liberal multiculturalism as the study of identity and difference politics to disrupt that very notion by taking a critical account. Well, how is liberal multiculturalism itself constructing the study of identity and difference, which is what the processes of meaning making allows us to do. It allows us to reflect both on the analytic tool that's being used and on the analysis that's being done. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Questions? And also illuminate.
I'm confused. One or the other.
You talk about processes of constructing identity. My interest is the construction of identity so overwhelming that marginalized or subaltern have no freedom or agency to create their own identity.
This is a really complex question. When I was looking through the example around Indigenous women, thinking about, is it possible to even think outside of a colonial context? And in terms of Muslim women, is it possible to think outside a context of Islamophobia? I mean, that's in a sense a question. I think that there can be agency in resisting that. I think there can be agency in particular your own systems of meaning making, which is one of the things that has come up. For example, the Aboriginal Women's Roundtable that was held a few years ago by Status Women Canada. Many of the women at the roundtable spoke to turning to family, spiritual, different kinds of health approaches to define their own systems of meaning making, not to be defined through a colonial context, but not to be unaware of the colonial context. So you can have agency within that, but I'm not sure how independently you can operate outside of that context, at least within the kind of Canadian framework that I'm looking at. I don't know, like, do you have different thoughts on that?
Well, it seems an extraordinarily dangerous process from my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Expose yourself to that. I can't describe what the dangerous project. And first of all, why would you want to?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be characterized as a dissident, crackpot or something. And I think in terms of your little group, it's important to define that, but and keep that there maybe as a source of identity. I don't know, I don't have that answer to that one.
Mm-hmm. But I think you're right to recognize that there are some dangers in also operating